I once thought nothing could shake me more than the earthquake that cracked my driveway in half when I was 8, but that was before I saw my 200-foot redwood trees lying like fallen soldiers across my property line, limbs splintered, trunks carved up like firewood, and my HOA president Karen standing there sipping an iced latte like she'd just plucked a weed. I dropped my hiking backpack. My legs turned to cement. She gave me a little wave and said, "Oh hey, figured I'd tidy up the curb appeal while you were out playing mountain man." It took everything in me not to scream. Those weren't just trees. They were living history, federally protected redwoods my grandfather planted 50 years ago as part of a national conservation project. Trees I grew up climbing. Trees that shielded endangered birds, cooled our land, and were legally untouchable without triggering federal penalties. Karen hadn't just hacked a few limbs, she'd just committed a felony with a smile and a pair of designer sunglasses. Just a week earlier, things were normal. Quiet. Predictable. My name's Sam, and I'm what people might call environmentally obsessed. I live on the edge of a residential community I inherited from my grandfather, an old-school conservationist and proud tree hugger long before that was trendy. The house is modest, but the land? It's gold. Acres of thick, lush greenery tucked between suburbia and serenity, guarded by a tree line of giant redwoods like nature's castle wall. When I moved in, the HOA left me mostly alone, probably assuming I wouldn't last long in a place where every mailbox is painted beige and lawn flamingos are considered contraband. But I kept my yard clean, paid my dues, and didn't bother anyone, until Karen decided my trees were ruining her vision. Karen. Mid-50s, always dressed like she's going to a country club brunch, with the charm of a cranky cat and the tenacity of a weed in sidewalk crack. She wasn't elected to her position as HOA president, she absorbed it, like mold in a forgotten sandwich. Her obsession with curb appeal was legendary. Once fined a neighbor for inconsistent grass height. Made another resident repaint their mailbox because the color clashed with the HOA vibe. So when she first made a comment about my redwoods being a bit overbearing, I thought she was joking. I laughed. She didn't. The passive-aggressive letters started next. Folded neatly in HOA letterhead envelopes, typed in 12-point Times New Roman like a ransom note from a corporate accountant. The tree line obstructs the street's aesthetic cohesion. Your northern redwoods violate visibility parameters. Trimming suggested for visual harmony. Visual harmony? These weren't rose bushes. I responded with a copy of my grandfather's federal conservation deed, highlighting the section stating that no person, group, or governing body may trim, alter, or remove these trees without federal oversight and explicit permission. I even underlined it in blue ink. Karen responded with silence, at least, until I went camping. It wasn't a long trip. Just a weekend out in Sequoia National Park to clear my head and test a prototype solar battery I'd been building. I left everything in order. When I returned Sunday evening, dust on my boots and a smile on my face, that's when I saw it. The horror show. It looked like a natural disaster, but the clean cuts, the sawdust piles, the neatly bundled limbs, it was calculated. Intentional. And there, in the middle of it, stood Karen like she was posing for a garden magazine. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe a city crew got confused. Maybe a storm broke branches and someone tried to help. But then I saw the bright orange flags stuck in the stumps, marked Karen's Landscaping Solutions. I stared at them like they were tombstones. My mouth went dry. She walked over casually, sipping her drink, and said, "You'll thank me later. This will really open up the view. Your place looked like a jungle before." My vision blurred. I was so stunned I couldn't speak. My family's legacy gone. Years of conservation wiped out by an entitled woman with no authority and zero respect for the law. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I walked straight past her, into my house, and pulled out the dusty folder my grandfather gave me when he passed. Inside was the original contract with the U.S. Department of the Interior. Full documentation of the Redwoods' protected status. Satellite photos, signatures, stamps, even the plaque that used to sit at the foot of the largest tree, reading part of the Redwood Reclamation Initiative, "Do not disturb." That plaque was now nowhere to be found. I called the local police. They showed up, glanced at the trees, shrugged, and told me it was a civil matter. Neighbor dispute, they said. Maybe settle it through mediation. I wanted to scream. These weren't fence lines or loud parties. This was a violation of federal law. But Karen? She was unfazed. She even had the gall to post in the HOA newsletter that a community beautification project was successfully completed. She framed it like a group decision, even claimed the trees were leaning dangerously. I knew then this wasn't going to be resolved with a conversation. Karen had stepped on a landmine, and she didn't even know it. She didn't just break HOA guidelines. She vandalized federally protected land, and if there's one thing more serious than HOA pettiness, it's the U.S. government when you mess with its trees. The problem was, no one else around here seemed to grasp the gravity of it yet. The neighbors were too scared to challenge her, and the local authorities were too uninformed to act. But I wasn't about to let this go. These redwoods were more than just trees. They were legacy, law, and life itself. My grandfather spent his final years fighting to keep them standing. Now it was my turn. Karen had made a colossal mistake. She thought she could trim her way to some fictional version of suburbia perfection. What she didn't realize was that her beautification project had just triggered a federal offense. And I had the proof, the paperwork, and the motivation to make sure she paid for every single ring of those fallen giants. This wasn't just going to be about restoring my tree line. No. It was about to become a lesson in consequences. One Karen would never forget. The silence in my house that night was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards and the low hum of my refrigerator. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of those trees, my trees, reduced to splinters and stumps. I stood in the hallway, holding the federal conservation documents like they were sacred scripture, flipping through every page to reassure myself this nightmare could be undone. Each line of ink confirmed what I already knew. Those trees were not only protected, they were untouchable. But Karen had touched them. Karen had butchered them with reckless entitlement and a manicure that probably cost more than a chainsaw. And now I had to figure out how to make sure the world understood that this wasn't just some neighborhood squabble over landscaping. This was criminal. I started my morning with a call to the regional office of the Department of the Interior. A tired-sounding woman named Beth picked up, and I gave her the short version: illegal destruction of federally protected redwoods, evidence of unauthorized logging, potential theft of lumber. Her voice sharpened as I mentioned the conservation contract. She asked me to email photos and documentation. 10 minutes later, I sent over drone footage from my neighbor's kid's quadcopter, satellite comparisons from last month, and the scanned conservation agreement signed by my grandfather and stamped by the U.S. Forest Service in 1987. I didn't hear back immediately, but I could sense the wheels beginning to turn. What really burned was that Karen hadn't stopped at destruction. She'd monetized it. My neighbor Paul, a retired carpenter who occasionally freelanced as a contractor, pulled me aside later that afternoon. He hesitated, but finally admitted he'd seen workers haul away the fallen logs to a flatbed truck 2 days before I got back. He didn't want to get involved, but something about it didn't sit right with him. They were loading them too carefully. Too cleanly. He thought it looked more like a sale than a cleanup. I thanked him and asked if he recognized the company name. He hadn't seen a name on the truck, but he remembered a man in a green jacket and aviators directing the workers and talking to Karen like they were old friends. I started calling around to local lumber yards and mills, trying to find out if anyone had recently acquired redwood logs. Most told me nothing or said they didn't handle that kind of inventory. But one guy, Lenny, owner of a private mill about 20 miles out, told me he'd just received a shipment of redwood that smelled too fresh to be legit. He said the seller claimed it came from an authorized urban project, but didn't offer documentation. When I asked for a name, he got cagey. Said he didn't want to get involved. I offered to pay him just to take a look. He finally relented, and I drove there immediately. When I arrived, Lenny led me to a side lot stacked with massive redwood logs, clean-cut, freshly milled ends, and still sticky with sap. My stomach turned. These weren't just any redwoods. I recognized the markings on one of them, the initials JH carved into the base. My grandfather used to mark the trees he planted from seed. That was his signature. Seeing it there, half-sawn, was like looking at a corpse with your last name on the tag. I took photos, GPS coordinates, and asked Lenny if I could get a sample for confirmation. He handed me a chip and wished me luck. He didn't want trouble, but he didn't want to be part of a crime either. Back home, I started piecing it all together. Karen hadn't just destroyed trees out of spite, she'd seen a profit opportunity. Redwoods were valuable, especially mature ones. Even illegal lumber had a market if you knew the right people. She probably thought no one would notice if a few trees vanished. Maybe she figured I'd be too stunned or too soft to fight back. What she didn't realize was that this land, and everything on it, was my family's legacy. And she hadn't just vandalized property, she'd desecrated history. I dug deeper into public records and found something even more interesting. Karen had quietly applied for a landscaping grant through a local community beautification fund offered by the county. In the application, she claimed the HOA was initiating an eco-focused revitalization of the northern property lines to improve visibility and promote safer walking routes. Her application included satellite photos, my satellite photos, from before the trees were cut. She had doctored the paperwork, submitted it under the HOA's name without board approval, and pocketed the grant money. Suddenly, this wasn't just about federal crimes. This was local fraud, too. Fueled by fury and caffeine, I printed everything: emails, photos, records, footage, and drove to the county office the next morning. I met with a grant administrator named Oscar, who was visibly pale by the time I finished showing him the evidence. He promised to escalate the issue and notify their fraud division. I left him with a flash drive labeled Karen's Tree Massacre Evidence. Before I even got to my car, he ran outside to say, "Hey, you might want to talk to the state forestry office too. This could get bigger." By now, Karen had gone quiet. No newsletter. No passive-aggressive visit. No signs of remorse. I had half expected her to strut by with a Starbucks and a smug smile again, but the silence from her end was louder than any chainsaw. She must have realized something was off. Maybe she sensed the tide turning. Or maybe she was just planning her next move. I wasn't about to wait for it. I contacted a local environmental attorney, Meredith, who specialized in conservation dispute. After reviewing my materials, she asked me one simple question: "Are you ready to go federal?" I nodded. She smiled and said, "Good. Because this is textbook felony-level environmental destruction, and we're going to hang her with her own pruning shears." She explained how we could build a case not only for federal destruction of protected land, but for restitution, environmental rehabilitation mandates, and even jail time if theft and fraud could be proven. It was more than I'd hoped for, and exactly what Karen deserved. Later that evening, I set up wildlife cameras and motion sensors near the remaining trees, just in case. I wasn't taking any chances. I also installed 2 hidden trail cams aimed at my property line. If she so much as sneezed in the direction of another tree, I'd have her on 4K footage. As I looked out over the hacked-up clearing that used to be a living wall of giants, I felt grief, yes, but also determination. Karen thought this was over. She thought I'd sulk, maybe complain a little, then let it go. What she didn't understand was that this wasn't just about redwoods. It was about respect, for nature, for law, for legacy. And now, with the law on my side and the evidence stacking up like cordwood, Karen was about to find out what happens when you try to clear-cut someone's history. The roots of those trees ran deep, and now, so did my resolve. I spent the next few days turning my property into a digital fortress. Between the trail cams, motion detectors, and a weatherproof drone dock, I had every square inch under surveillance. My grandfather used to say, "You can't stop the storm, but you can sure build a better roof," and I took that to heart. Karen had brought the storm, but I was ready this time. While she remained suspiciously quiet, I stayed busy gathering witness statements, compiling time-stamped images, and tracking every chain of custody detail for the illegally harvested wood. Every step was another nail in her legal coffin, but something told me Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. She'd tasted control for too long to give it up without one last swing of the hedge trimmers. That swing came in the form of a new landscaping crew that showed up one morning without warning. I spotted the truck first, a black pickup with Green Horizon Services plastered across the side in bold green vinyl. I didn't recognize the name, but the crew had gas-powered saws, hard hats, and enough cable to rig a bridge. One of them walked straight up to the tree line I had left standing and began uncoiling rope, as if preparing for another harvest. I stepped outside, phone in hand, heart pounding. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The guy looked up, squinted, and said, "We're here for the trimming job. North Perimeter, HOA order." I forced a smile. "You got a permit?" He hesitated. Karen said everything was cleared. "We're just the crew." I asked him to wait, stepped back inside, and called Meredith, my attorney. She didn't even let me finish before barking instructions. "Tell them to stop. Show them the federal protection documents. If they touch another branch, it's a violation. And call Ranger Tilly, I've already briefed her." Ranger Tilly was a no-nonsense Forest Service officer with a ponytail, a pickup full of citations, and a love for endangered species that rivaled my own. She had already started sniffing around Karen's activity after the Department of the Interior passed my case along to her. I called and explained the situation. She was there within 30 minutes, wearing mirrored sunglasses and the expression of someone who had buried more illegal loggers than she'd cared to count. The moment she stepped onto my property, the landscaping crew went still. Tilly approached the man holding the saw, badge out, voice calm but lethal. "Sir, I need to see your work order, your permits, and your personal identification, right now." They had none of the above. When she asked where they'd gotten their instructions, they pointed across the cul-de-sac to Karen's house. Of course. Tilly excused them, took my statement, then marched over to Karen's pristine front porch and rang the bell. I watched from my property as Karen opened the door. The moment she saw the badge, her face stiffened. She tried to play it off, smiling, gesturing, acting confused, but Tilly wasn't buying it. She spoke firmly, handed Karen a document, then turned and walked away. Karen slammed the door so hard it rattled her wind chimes. Tilly returned and handed me a copy of the cease and desist order she'd just issued. "That's the last time they come near your trees. If she tries this again, she won't just be facing fines, she'll be looking at jail time." That should have been the end of it. But Karen's ego was bigger than her sense of self-preservation. That evening, I received an anonymous tip through a private message on the neighborhood app. The message simply read, "Karen is planning something tonight. Keep your cameras rolling." There was no name attached, but I had a feeling it came from someone on the HOA board who had finally had enough. I double-checked my surveillance feeds, made sure everything was recording, and waited. Around midnight, headlights flickered in the distance. A white van rolled slowly past my property, parked on the far corner near the trail entrance, and idled with the lights off. Two figures slipped out the side, carrying what looked like toolboxes. They approached the tree line, crouched low, and started measuring trunks with a tape measure. I stayed inside, watching through the camera feed, finger hovering over the call button for Tilly. I waited until one of them pulled out what looked like a handheld saw and started to test it near the base of a tree. Then I hit record, dialed Tilly, and gave her the coordinate. She arrived in less than 10 minutes, Lights off, sneaking up with her partner like it was an episode of National Geographic. The moment she yelled, "Federal Ranger! Hands in the air!" both intruders dropped their tools and froze. One of them bolted but was quickly tackled. The other? None other than Karen's cousin, a local contractor with a history of environmental code violations. The ranger cuffed them, read them their rights, and informed them they were being detained on suspicion of federal conservation law violations and trespassing. Karen didn't even come outside to defend them. Her house was dark. She must have known the hammer was about to drop. The next morning, I received a formal notification from the Department of the Interior. An official investigation was now open. Karen's actions, including the destruction of protected redwoods, unauthorized sale of lumber, and repeated attempts to circumvent federal law, were now being reviewed by a task force focused on environmental crimes. And thanks to the evidence, trail cam footage, financial records from the landscaping grant, and statements from her own board, there was little doubt she'd be facing multiple charges. To make things even more surreal, a week later I received a call from an agent working on behalf of the Department of Justice. They were forming a case against illegal logging and wanted to use my footage as part of a national awareness campaign. He told me, "You might have just taken down the HOA version of a timber mafia boss." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Meanwhile, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Karen's once loyal circle began to fray. People who had been afraid to speak out started coming forward. One neighbor admitted Karen had fined her for putting up bird feeders. Another revealed Karen once ordered her to cut down a native flowering bush because it attracted bugs. It was like someone had pulled the cork off years of frustration, and now everyone was letting loose. The new HOA meeting was unlike anything I'd seen before. The room was packed. Karen showed up late, tried to conduct business as usual, but the board members stopped her. One stood up and read a motion to suspend her from her duties pending legal proceedings. A vote was held on the spot. Unanimous. Karen stood there, mouth open, staring around the room like she couldn't comprehend what was happening. When she tried to object, the new acting president, a retired firefighter named Doug, simply said, "You lost the right to speak for us the moment you put your ego ahead of federal law." Karen stormed out. The room erupted in quiet cheers and clapping. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. This was about trust, accountability, and ending the reign of a tyrant in designer heels. As I walked home from the meeting, I looked over at the line of remaining redwood. Still tall, still proud, still mine. The storm had come, but the roots had held strong. And now, with Karen finally on the ropes, it was time to plant the seeds of real justice. The courtroom smelled like lemon-scented floor polish and nerve. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Meredith, my attorney, who radiated the kind of calm confidence you'd expect from someone who's made a living dismantling bullies with legal precision. Across from us sat Karen, arms crossed, eyes darting, lips pursed so tight they could cut glass. She had traded her usual pastel blazers and pearls for a plain black suit, clearly attempting to look serious and remorseful. It wasn't working. Her smugness still leaked through in little ways. The way she kept fixing her hair, the fake surprise she wore when the judge read the charges, the eye roll when they mentioned federal protections. She didn't think this was real. Not yet. But it was. She was facing multiple felony charges: unlawful destruction of federally protected natural resources, theft of government property, fraudulent use of grant funds, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. And it wasn't just me versus her anymore. It was me, the Department of the Interior, the County Fraud Division, and the full weight of environmental law. She'd gone too far, crossed too many lines, and now she was about to learn that nature has lawyers too. The prosecution laid out everything in chilling detail. First came the drone footage of the initial tree cutting, paired with time-stamped images from my trail cams. Then they brought out the conservation agreement, complete with signatures, government stamps, and a copy of the commemorative plaque that once sat in the grove. The judge flipped through the papers slowly, eyes narrowing. Then came the kicker. Photos of the redwood logs at the mill, including the one with my grandfather's initials, now verified by forestry experts. Karen looked mildly surprised, probably realizing for the first time just how thorough I'd been. When the prosecutor introduced the landscaping grant fraud, the whole room shifted. They showed Karen's doctored application, which she'd submitted without board approval, and a bank statement showing she had transferred a portion of the funds into her personal account. Then came the witness statements: Paul the contractor, Lenny from the mill, and a nervous but brave HOA board member who confirmed that Karen had manipulated documents and intimidated anyone who questioned her. The judge didn't even hide his frown at that part. Karen's defense was as laughable as it was insulting. Her lawyer, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, argued that Karen believed the trees were dangerous and acted in the interest of public safety. He claimed she misunderstood the conservation status, didn't profit from the wood, and was simply trying to beautify the neighborhood. Karen nodded solemnly, like she was the victim of her own good intentions. Meredith stood up and calmly dismantled every piece of that narrative. She pointed out how Karen had ignored written proof of the tree's legal status, how she had sold the wood, not disposed of it, how she had forged signatures on grant applications and misrepresented her authority. And then she called me to the stand. I walked up slowly, heart pounding, palms damp. I wasn't a courtroom speaker, but I didn't have to be. I just had to tell the truth. I explained what the trees meant to me, how my grandfather had planted them as part of a national effort to bring redwoods back from the brink, how they had stood as both a memorial and a sanctuary. I described the moment I returned home to find them gone. The smell of fresh sawdust, the echo of silence where birds once nested, the grief, the rage, the disbelief. I told them about Karen's smirk, her comment about tidying up while I was away, her refusal to acknowledge the harm. I saw a few jurors shift in their seats, uncomfortable now. And then I pulled out the small wooden photo album my grandfather had made by hand, carved from redwood bark he'd collected before the protections went into place. Inside were faded pictures of him standing beside the saplings, holding me as a child, smiling with muddy boots and tree sap on his sleeves. I held it up and said, this wasn't just property. It was legacy. It was protected by law. And she didn't just cut down trees, she erased a piece of my family. There was a long pause after I stepped down. Karen's face had gone pale. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The prosecution rested. The jury didn't need long. Less than an hour. Guilty. On all counts. The judge didn't hold back during sentencing. Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the environmental damage, including the cost of replanting and rehabilitating the area under federal supervision. She was fined heavily for grant fraud and illegal lumber trafficking. But the real blow came with the court's decision to sentence her to 1 year of house arrest, 500 hours of community service in environmental education, and mandatory appearances at local schools to give presentations on the importance of tree conservation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The kicker? The court mandated that her community service uniform must include a bright green vest with bold white letters that read, "Ask me about federal tree law." It was poetic, beautiful, just. As we walked out of the courthouse, Meredith patted me on the shoulder and said, "I think your grandfather would be proud. You didn't just win a case, you protected a legacy." Back in the neighborhood, things had shifted. The new HOA president, Doug, was a quiet guy with a firefighter's steady hands and a strong moral compass. One of the first things he did was organize a volunteer cleanup and replanting day. Several neighbors, including a few who had been too scared to speak up before, showed up with shovels and gloves. A local nursery donated redwood saplings. Tilly even brought some wildlife-friendly shrubs and helped install owl boxes. It wasn't the same as what we'd lost, but it was a beginning. And Karen? She kept her curtains drawn most days, occasionally shuffling outside with a little trash grabber, picking up litter under the watchful eye of her court supervisor. The HOA revoked her voting rights, removed her from all decision-making roles, and made her return the funds she had reallocated. She'd become a cautionary tale, a suburban legend whispered about during evening walks. Still, I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't need her to suffer. I just needed the trees to come back. And slowly they were. One morning, while checking the new saplings, I noticed something small but remarkable. An owl perched on the branch of one of the younger trees, staring at me like it was guarding the place. I smiled. Maybe it was the same one that used to nest here. Maybe it was a descendant. Either way, it felt right. I installed a small wooden sign near the new grove. Nothing flashy. Just a simple message carved into reclaimed redwood. Respect what roots you. It wasn't over, not really. The land still bore scars. But the tide had turned. The trees were growing again. The law had held. And Karen, for the first time in her power-hungry reign, had been told no, and made to live with it. Months passed, and the seasons slowly shifted. Spring gave way to early summer, and with it came the steady progress of nature reclaiming what had been stolen. The new redwood saplings, planted with care by volunteers and guided by forestry experts, had begun to take root. Tiny but defiant, they reached upward with emerald tips that shimmered in the sunlight. It would be decades before they reached the height of their predecessors, but they stood as living proof that resilience runs deep, even when the roots have been hacked. Life in the neighborhood found a new rhythm. With Karen out of the HOA and stripped of any power, a calm settled in like fog over the hills. Doug, the new president, led with common sense and quiet authority. No more petty fines for mailbox placement or drama about flower colors. The HOA actually felt like a community for once, not a dictatorship ruled by someone with a superiority complex and a clipboard. People smiled more. They helped each other. Even the neighborhood kids seemed happier, playing near the tree line again without their parents worrying about Karen appearing with a citation. Karen, on the other hand, had become a walking contradiction. Court-mandated community service had turned her into the unwilling mascot of environmental education. Twice a week, she was required to show up to local middle schools wearing that fluorescent green vest with the words, "Ask me about federal tree law," printed on the back. The local paper ran a photo of her awkwardly standing next to a group of fifth graders while a teacher explained the importance of redwood preservation. Her forced smile looked like it might shatter under the weight of humiliation. But rules were rules, and the judge had been clear. Education through public accountability. One particularly surreal moment came when a group of neighbors held a Redwood Revival picnic near the edge of my property, a celebration of the newly planted trees and the community's efforts to restore the area. It was a mix of barbecue, potluck, live acoustic music, and heartfelt speeches. Doug even surprised me with a plaque commemorating my grandfather's legacy, mounted on a stone near the new saplings. It read, "In honor of James Harper, who planted hope with every seed." I hadn't cried through the court case, hadn't cried when the logs were hauled away, but I felt tears sting the edges of my eyes then. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about honoring what came before and protecting what still remained. Karen didn't attend the event, though she certainly saw the crowd from behind her tightly drawn curtains. I imagined her sitting inside with binoculars and a lukewarm glass of boxed wine, trying to understand how the very people she once controlled were now building something better without her. Her silence became her sentence. No one engaged with her any more beyond what the law required. Even her once loyal clique had abandoned ship, preferring a peaceful life over the constant chaos she brought. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, like a tumor that had been cleanly removed. The federal case officially closed weeks later, but the aftershocks rippled far beyond our little community. Environmental groups used Karen's case as a teaching moment, citing it at town halls and workshops about the importance of respecting federal land designations. The Department of the Interior published an online article about citizen action in conservation law, and my name was listed among those who had upheld the values of preservation with diligence and integrity. A nonprofit even reached out and offered me a position on their advisory board for urban green space protection. I didn't see that coming, but I accepted. If my experience could prevent another Karen from swinging a chainsaw at someone else's legacy, it would be worth it. My own life shifted too, in quiet but meaningful ways. I started working remotely full-time, which meant more hours at home, more mornings spent watching the sun rise through the trees, more evenings walking the perimeter with a cup of coffee and a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Wildlife slowly returned, owls, squirrels, even a deer or two who cautiously grazed near the young redwoods as if sensing the land was healing. I installed more cameras, not just for protection, but to document it all. This place, once the site of grief and betrayal, was turning into a sanctuary again. The final poetic touch came in the form of a small sign I mounted on the edge of my property, right where the first tree had been cut. It wasn't aggressive or vengeful. Just a piece of reclaimed redwood with a simple phrase carved into it: "Curb appeal isn't worth a felony." Doug chuckled when he saw it and promised to have the HOA officially endorse it as a community reflection point. Even the local ranger, Tilly, stopped by one day, leaned against her truck and said, "You know, I think those trees picked the right guy to watch over them." As for Karen, her sentence eventually ended. The community service was fulfilled, the fines were paid, likely with the help of a reverse mortgage or two, and she was legally free to resume her life. But freedom doesn't always mean restoration. Reputation is a fragile thing, especially in a place where gossip travels faster than wildfire. She became something of a cautionary tale, mentioned in hushed tones during HOA meetings and chuckled about over coffee. Her house remained, but her influence had withered. She couldn't touch a flower bed now without someone wondering if she had forged another document. I ran into her once at the grocery store. She was alone, standing in the produce aisle, inspecting cucumbers like they held the meaning of life. She looked up, met my eyes, and for the first time, didn't say a word. No fake smile, no snide remark, no attempt at control. Just a nod. Not quite an apology, but something close. I returned it, then turned away. There was nothing left to argue. The battle had already been won. Justice doesn't always come with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in soil and saplings, carried by the hands of people who refuse to let destruction be the final word. My grandfather taught me that a tree is more than wood, it's memory, time, purpose. And now, every leaf that trembles in the breeze feels like a promise kept. The redwoods are growing again. The land breathes easy. And Karen? She may still live here, but the roots no longer belong to her world. They're mine. They're ours. And they are protected forever.